oldest friends and colleagues at OSU, Professor William Uzgalis. Bill has taught all kinds of things for us. Those of you in philosophy know this. Those of you who aren't know that his wisdom, may not know that his wisdom and his expertise range over many fields. He's taught the early modern philosophy course for us for decades, Philosophy 302. He's taught the core courses in philosophy of mind and theory of knowledge. Okay? He also teaches worldviews and environmental values and Chinese philosophy, as well as the bunch of introductory courses. So he's really done a lot for us. Bill has got his PhD from Stanford, and whoops, I was going to say 1981. I know that's wrong because that's when Bill came to us. He worked on John Locke, and his most recent books are in that connection. His most recent books are A Reader's Guide to Locke's Essay Concerning Human Understanding, and more recently the correspondence of Samuel Clarke and Anthony Collins, which he edited. So he's a busy guy, and so without further ado, I'm going to introduce Bill to come talk about philosophy and the good life.
Thank you all so much for coming. I know this is a really busy time of year. I certainly am busy, and so I really appreciate your coming. What I plan to do is to start out by telling you that when I came here in 1981, I gave a public lecture, my first public lecture here about Plato, and for some reason or another, it didn't get a very good reception. So in order to forestall that happening here, we decided to arrange a reception afterwards at you. And there will be alcohol and snacks and, lovely things. And so those of you who, didn't like the talk very much can come and have a good reception anyway. So what led me to this topic actually was thinking about a trend in our culture that I've seen over a number of years. And that trend is to think that everything ought to operate like a business. So, we're repeatedly told that, gosh, we need to have government operate like business. I guess that means go out of business regularly. Never mind. Lately it's been educational institutions. And it always struck me as, kind of weird, because it just doesn't work very well, in spite of, what its advocates say. And I'll give you some reasons for that in a bit. But as I was thinking about this, it occurred to me that, this isn't happening by accident. There are enormous forces that are bringing about this change in the way we look at the world. Corporations themselves are giant monsters that bestride the world. I mean, if you look at multinational corporations, many of them have budgets that go way beyond the budgets of nation states. So, it struck me that really this notion that we ought to use this model to think about all of life really is not only problematic, but if you put it together with the forces that are driving it in the first place, it's not just problematic, it's catastrophic. And so part of what I plan to do today is to point out to you some of the ways in which the model and the forces which have imposed it on us really are catastrophic for us. And I think part of the reason that this sort of doesn't become more obvious is we don't put the pieces together. So that's what I plan on doing for you. And then, we'll look at some ways of thinking about this that involve philosophy that might help us stop doing this. So, if you think about just the structure of corporations, there was this wonderful movie made, I don't know, a dozen years ago called The Corporation. And what that movie does is to suggest that if we look at the amount of corporate crime in the world, it is considerable. And the explanation that is standardly given for it in the media is, well, they're just bad apples, more bad apples. Bad people in good institutions. And the movie suggests that that isn't really true at all, that the problem with corporations is structural. Their purpose is to provide profit for their stockholders, and in order to do that, they externalize costs wherever they can. And largely, this leads to all kinds of different forms of bad behavior and crimes regularly. So the very institution itself spawns criminality. In addition to that, when we're told, for example, that government ought to operate like a business, well, businesses are aimed at producing wealth for their owners or their stockholders in the case of corporations. And government has an altogether different function, which is to take care of the public good. And when you try to mix these two things, what happens is that every time you put a for-profit entity in the middle of an effort to provide a public good, it subverts it. And you only have to think about private prisons in order to see how this works. Gosh, I own this prison, and what do I want? I want more prisoners. So what am I going to do? I'm going to go lobby the state legislature to increase the strictness of laws, increase the penalties, increase the length that people are in prison so that I get paid more. But that subverts the purpose of prisons altogether. It's being done in the interest of making money, not in the interest of reforming people or, punishing them justly, or anything that we might consider is really the public good. And one can also see this rather clearly in the for-profit educational industry. The education department recently started refusing to deal with various for-profit colleges because, as it turned out, they were making their money off federal loans to students who they weren't educating, who graduated, couldn't get jobs, couldn't pay back their loans, and were left out high and dry. So, all of this is disturbing. But there are even more disturbing things. If you look at the relation of corporations to the environment, I would be inclined to say, having taught worldviews and environmental values for many years and tried to keep up with the literature, that it is the corporate world that is largely responsible for the fact that the United States has failed to respond in any kind of timely way to the climate change crisis that we face. And we are doing terrible things to the rest of life on Earth. And once again, I, put that squarely, the responsibility squarely for that on the corporate world. What this also suggests is, well, one more step before that. One of the things that clearly has happened as a result of the corporatization of the world is the creation of a vast inequality of wealth. And one of the things that allows to happen is if you plump money up at the top of a system, well, the people up at the top have enough money to buy the government. And that is precisely what they have done. The evidence, such as it is, really suggests that we have found the conditions necessary for the functioning of an effective democracy subverted by our own economic system. And, if you think of the free flow of information as the life breath of democracy, and you consider that, not too long ago, we had functioning newsrooms with, pretty honorable reporters, and that all of that went away not so long ago. And all of those television news units are now part of the entertainment units of those corporations. And there was a Supreme Court decision in the case of a couple of investigative reporters who sued Fox News for firing them because the Fox News affiliate that they belonged to was trying to get them to change a story about Monsanto in such a way that, it would make Monsanto happy. And the case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court found that, these folks really could not appeal their firing on the basis of whistleblower laws because it simply is not illegal to lie when you tell the news. Okay? So, information, the lifeblood of the life breath of democracy. Well, I'll start choking. More disturbing for me, I guess, in some ways, is that, when what you have is a change in the form of government from a democracy to the rule of the rich and the few, an oligarchy, all of these kinds of tendencies I've been talking about just start reinforcing one another. Because when the rich control the government, well, then they can change all the rules in their own favor, which is exactly what they do. And, under the circumstances, it costs big bucks in order to have access to the decision makers. So most of the rest of us are left out, and who gets what they want? Well, the people who can pay for it. There is another sense in which this business model has not served us well. And that is in respect to our own lives. what I'm focusing on here is the very notion that is at the heart of the business model, which is, gosh, the most important thing is money and wealth and the procurement of wealth. And philosophers sometimes make a distinction between intrinsic and instrumental value. And amongst the examples which people give of intrinsic value, that is, things have intrinsic value when they're in themselves valuable. The kind of paradigm case of things that have intrinsic value are, well, people, okay? You know, this is a philosophical distinction. You can think of Kant's kingdom of ends. And amongst the things that have instrumental value, and instrumental value is a kind of value where something is good for something else, is, you'd never guess, money. Okay? So, you know, we carry around these pictures of pieces of paper with pictures of dead men on them. A rather peculiar custom, if you think about it. And we do it because, well, it gets us lunch or other things. In itself, you know, you just need to ask yourself, if it wouldn't get you lunch or other things, would you really carry around, you know, these pictures of dead presidents in your pocket? And, you know, things with pyramids with weird eyes on top of them, you know? I kind of don't think so. Now, it is true that some money does have intrinsic value. And usually it's because it's a work of art and people collect it. But what's notable about you know, that kind of money is that what people want to have is have it uncirculated, have it pristine. Because as soon as it starts getting circulated, you know, it loses its intrinsic value and becomes, well, you know, just of instrumental value. And it's also, you know, part of what's to be said about this, this distinction is that, well, things can have purely intrinsic value, they can have purely instrumental value, or they can have both. Okay? So another example, and this one is going to be of some use to me as we go along, is work. So work is something that we tend to think is important. It's contrasted with play. Children play while adults work. You know, the one isn't very serious, the other is. Well, actually, if you think about work, and you think about the fact that, gosh, most people wouldn't do the jobs they were doing if they weren't paid to do them. What you realize is that work has, for a lot of people, purely instrumental value. And what they get from it is something else that has purely instrumental value, which is money. Okay? And you need money for all those things that you need money for. So, you know, you've got to do this stuff that you don't really like doing in order to get the stuff that you need, and so on. It is true, there are some forms of work that have some intrinsic value. Being a philosophy professor is pretty good. Okay? And, you know, there are other kinds of work where, you know, people are flourishing as a result of being in those activities. And I don't want to deny that. In fact, I want to insist on it. But for the vast bulk of the population, it just isn't true. Work does not give people the meaning of life or make them fulfilled and happy individuals. It just is the grind they have to go through in order to get that other bit of instrumental value that they need in order to go on living. Now, if it were the case that somehow work were to be made to help people grow up, to mature, to learn how to use their abilities and powers in order to make good decisions, and we're allowed to exercise those abilities, and consequently ended up becoming more mature and more fulfilled. Well, I guess philosophers like me would take work more seriously. But mostly that isn't the way it is. And there is even a segment of our population, and perhaps a good deal of the rest of the world, for whom work even fails to provide the basic standard of living that people need. There are the working poor who still aren't making it. And this has led sociologists to write books like The Betrayal of Work. So, there's work for you. The contrast with work is usually play. And we tend to think that play is for children, for the most part. We don't take it very seriously. But when you think about it in terms of the scheme of intrinsic and instrumental value, play is more valuable than work is, because play has intrinsic value, and intrinsic value ought to trump instrumental value, because it's something that's just worth having in itself, not something that you need in order to get something else or do something else. So, if you think about play, there are times when, well, gosh, not only would you do it without somebody paying you to do it, you might pay to do it, right? There's this example that one of my friends mentioned to me the other day. I think it's golf, right? I guess you have to pay to play golf most of the time. And people do it on a regular basis. I think that's because they want to actually pretend they're Scotsmen. But, really the point here is that play represents a whole series of activities which are in themselves valuable. And, once you begin to mull over this distinction, you start seeing, well, gosh, once you make this distinction, all kinds of things that look one way actually turn out to be some other way. Now, what that suggests is that, gosh, we make mistakes about value. And so, if you start saying to yourself, well, what kind of mistakes do we make? Well, you might start out with really blatant cases, right? Just to, be clear about how it works. You might take a group of people and insist that they only have instrumental value for us who have intrinsic value. And when you carry this into action, what you get is slavery in all of its different nasty variations, and racism and sexism and, all of that kind of stuff. And, once again, just to point out to you the utility of this distinction, I have stood in front of classes and asked them, gosh, what's wrong with chattel slavery? And they sit there in silence without being able to answer. And yet, if you make this distinction, it's easy. Okay? So, once again, making these kinds of mistakes leads to bad behavior. The point I was just making. And so, you know, if you consider taking money as the primary value, what you're in effect doing is saying, money has intrinsic value. No, it doesn't. It doesn't. And what you're inclined to do in cases like that is, well, you know, value is such a neutral word, you know. What we're really talking about here is what's good, what's worthwhile, what you want to have. And so, you know, if you say, well, you know, money at any cost and anything I have to do to get it, well, then, you know, cheat, steal, kill, you know, any of those things will do. Because, gee, getting money, isn't that more important than people's welfare? Well, in a lot of cases, that's what the evidence shows that corporate leaders actually think. Okay? You know, should we recall these cars that are turning over? You know, Ford Explorer comes to mind. Let's talk to the lawyers. Well, the lawyers say, don't recall those cars. You know, there's going to be some accidents, people are going to get hurt, people are going to die, but, you know, we'll just go to court, and in the end, you'll pay a whole lot less going down that road than recalling all those cars and fixing them. Engaging in this kind of activity simply becomes a cost of business. So, that's a problem. And, you know, we, in our educational system, these days, you know, what you hear from politicians is, what are universities for? And what you hear from students is the same thing, right? The same answer. It's gonna get me a job. I'm gonna be a worker, right? And I find that very disturbing. And I find it disturbing because what I think it does is to give us a view of what human potential is and what humans can be that shortchanges everybody. And this kind of view is, well, you know, gosh, I'm going to be a worker. Well, you know, we just talked about work a little bit earlier. Oh boy, what a great life that's going to be for you, you know. Here you are at a university, you're sitting around, you know, you're finding out about the world, you get to sit in classes and ponder free will and determinism, you know, and then you go out and you work. And of course, students are desperate to go out and work. They don't want to be here. And I keep telling them they're silly. You know, they're silly because this place is where you get to think, where you get to ponder. When you go out there, no. You know, you're going to be trying to make a mortgage and support the kids. Good luck, you know. And you're going to be too busy to do anything about bad government, for example, or corporate crime, or anything about the world that really needs fixing. So here's another aspect of what that corporate world does for us. It makes us passive. And it does it quite deliberately. Because, well, you know, especially in an oligarchy, you don't want the populace messing with what the oligarchs want to do. So you use advertising to convince people that they're happy and they, you know, things are just fine. And there is an anti-intellectual strain in our culture, a strong anti-intellectual strain that basically says, you know, thinking about stuff, gosh, those people are just stupid. I mean, why would you want to do that? You know? And so I'm going to tell you why you would want to do that. And the answer is, from another of my philosophical heroes, John Locke, that having an inquisitive mind that does not give in to authority, that sifts out the truth for itself, is the very basis of freedom. Without it, there is no self-government, either for yourself or for your society. And to the degree that you give up that ability, to the degree that you say, well, you know, whatever happens, you know, I'm okay, you know, I don't have to do anything, it's nice, you know, I don't have to go out in the streets, I don't have to write people and try to make things better. Well, to the degree that, you know, you give up your ability to make judgments about what is for the best, you are giving up your freedom. And you're not only giving it up, they're taking it away from you. So, one of the things that Socrates said to the Athenians when they had condemned him to death is this famous line about, you know, the unexamined life is not worth living. Okay? And my fellow philosophers who ponder all of this are fascinated by what Socrates means by examination. I think we would do better to think about what he means by life. So, here's what I think he means. I think Socrates holds that what you have to do in order to have a life is to pick a chief goal, figure out what the appropriate means are for pursuing that goal, and then go for it with all the vigor you've got, and all the talents, and all of the, you know, skills. And there are a whole variety of goals that, you know, people sometimes pick. You can pick wealth, which is, you know, what our culture advocates. And if you want to do that, the appropriate means are to become a banker, and then, you know, steal from your bank. That is the prime directive for bankers these days. You know, if you really want to get rich, get a bank, and if you want to steal from it, own it, because that's the way to go. Or you can start a corporation like Walmart, right, and end up with billions while making your workers get food stamps. Oh, how nice. If you want to have honor as your chief goal, well, become a soldier. Okay, and that's the road to honor, I guess. And Socrates, of course, has this other alternative, which is the examined life. That is, the life of a philosopher. And of course, not just any philosopher, because lots of us, you know, don't really examine these kinds of things very deeply. but the life of the Socratic philosophy. And part of the reason for this is that Socrates is convinced that what we all really want is the best in life. That's what we really want. And we really don't want something that just appears to be the best and isn't. Right? If you got what appeared to be the best and it wasn't, you would feel cheated when you found out. So, you know, if we lived in a world in which it was just obvious what was good and what wasn't, well, we wouldn't make mistakes about value, about what's good. We wouldn't take some things that, you know, yeah, they're kind of good, and think that they're a whole lot better than they really are. Or, you know, take things that turn out really to be good and think, well, you know, gosh, that's not really important. Education. So, the way Socrates and Plato, and by the way, there are others, the Confucians like Mencius have exactly the same view in lots of ways. If you live in a world where some things appear to be good but really aren't, and other things, you know, don't appear to be particularly good but they really are, well, then you need to engage in examination, because that's what you really need to figure out. And on Socrates and Plato's view, that was what philosophy was for. It did that job of sorting out what appeared to be good from what really was good. And what Socrates is politely telling the Athenians, who have just condemned him to death, is, well, you know, you guys picked a lot of goals, and, you know, somehow I'm bugging you about that, and bugging you enough so you can get rid of me. And by the way, you're all wasting your time, right? You pick goals that you're pursuing with all your energy and all of the time in your life, which aren't going to get you what you want. Now, Socrates and Plato had an astonishing view of how to determine what's good. It's one that, I doubt we're likely to buy completely, and I'm not sure I buy it completely. But the idea is, well, take a look at all of those crafts and arts that reliably produce good things. Shoemaking, piloting, doctors, okay? So, you go to a shoemaker and you say, well, look, could you rate shoes for me from, the best to the worst, and tell me why they're the best and the worst? And shoemaker, if he's really good, will go, well, of course, here's the materials, here's the construction, this is good for this, that's good for that. Or you go to a doctor and you say, well, could you rate bodies for me? Could you tell me, what the healthiest body is and what the sickest is, and, the grades in between? And the doctor would go, sure, I can do that. Okay, and here's, number one, number two, number three, number 10, and here's why they grade the way they do. That's what Socrates wants for lives. He wants an art of life. And when you think about it, it is an astonishing vision. I'm inclined to think that, while that's nice, what we want is something a little more democratic, a little more something that everyone can do. And so I go back to Locke, and I say, well, what we really want is a world in which we're encouraged, and not just encouraged, but have it explained to us why we have to use our minds in an active way to find out the way things are. And we need to insist that we be provided with that information. Because if we're not, well, we're not going to have the skills and the abilities to make those kinds of decisions about what is best for ourselves, and we're not going to be able to make those kinds of decisions about what's best for our society. And, you know, I think the lovely thing about philosophy and any kind of educational activity that really engages the mind and forces it to think through things and try and sift and figure out what's true. All of those things are enormously helpful. The thing about philosophy is, you know, many a time has it done this, and it's still here to help us figure these things out. So, you know, if you look at those forces that are trying to make us passive, one of the things they have done is to destroy every institution we have that tries to make us active. And the most obvious example is unions. Okay? There was a robust union movement in this country, and it was destroyed deliberately. And the other likely candidate is, well, you'd never guess, colleges and universities. Okay? And they are being muzzled. You know, John Dewey, that wonderful man, had an enormous influence in the world. He was a great public intellectual. And after he died, suddenly it was gone. And I think there's a reason why that happened. And it's called the McCarthy era. Because, you know, anybody who was carrying on that tradition would have had a robust political philosophy that could have made all kinds of criticisms of government. And philosophers, on the whole, are, you know, cowards. And so what you got was an analytic philosophy for 20 years. That kind of philosophy that doesn't really have anything to do with the world. And we've got to stop that. We've got to face the fact that we have a model for how to run our lives and our country and our society that is in many ways just wretched, that's doing all kinds of damage to us, to our society, to other people, and to the world. And we've got to think our way through it, figure out, you know, where the weak points are, and change them one at a time. Because you can't change the whole thing all at once. But, you know, once you start thinking this through, things start to become obvious. Like, we need to reform the media. Because we need to know what's going on. Okay? Well, that's probably a doable project in some way or another, you know? I think philosophy can help in all of this by helping us think through values, and that's what I came here to tell you. So, thank you.